Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great, okay. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Salatino and I am the Anne Vogt Fuller and Marion Titus Searle Chair and Curator of the Department of Prints and Drawings here at the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, held in conjunction with the two recently opened exhibitions, Revolution to Restoration, French Drawings from the Horvitz Collection, and French Neoclassical Paintings from the Horvitz Collection. If you haven't already had the opportunity, please do visit both shows after today's talk, and many times in the future, over the next few months. The 90 drawings and 25 paintings in both exhibitions come, as their titles indicate, from the extraordinary Horvitz Collection, the most important private collection of French art from the 16th to the 19th centuries in the United States, indeed in the world. Before we begin, on behalf of all of us at the museum, I want especially to thank Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz, both of whom are in today's audience, for their ongoing leadership and support for the Art Institute. Thank you for sharing, through these two exhibitions, a small part of your wonderful collection with us and with our visitors. Allow me to note that support for this program is provided by the Allan McNab Endowed Fund. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Margaret Morgan Grasselli. An expert on and longstanding champion of French drawings, especially of the 18th century, Meg Grasselli worked for the National Gallery of Art for 40 years, 30 of them as curator of Old Master drawings, where she organized many exhibitions, distinguished by their beauty, scholarship, and popularity. From the legendary monographic show Watteau, 1684 to 1721, held in 1984, Meg is particularly an expert on the drawings of Antoine Watteau, about whom she has published frequently. To Renaissance to Revolution, French drawings from the National Gallery of Art, 1500 to 1800, held in 2009. To the splendid 2016 exhibition devoted to the great French 18th century painter draftsman Hubert Robert, held at the National Gallery and at the Louvre. After retiring from the National Gallery in 2020, Meg, who has clearly been no less busy since retirement than she was during her distinguished career, spent 3 years as visiting senior scholar for drawings at the Harvard Art Museums, where she also served as visiting lecturer in Harvard's Department of the History of Art. She was also, last year, museum scholar in the drawings department of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Dr. Grasselli's publications are far too numerous to mention, but allow me at least to single out one of my favorites. Her 2003 exhibition catalog, Colorful Impressions, The Printmaking Revolution in 18th Century France, a work that has since become a classic in its field. That she was also co-author of the catalog of a stunning exhibition at the Harvard Art Museums last year, American Watercolors, 1880 to 1990, Into the Light, is merely a testament to her versatility and wide-ranging knowledge. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that Meg is also a scholar of unfailing generosity and collegiality. And now, without further delay, please join me in warmly welcoming Meg Grasselli, whose eminently topical talk today, more relevant than one might immediately realize, is called Neoclassical Drawings, What's Old is New Again. Meg.
Hello. Thank you very much for coming at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon on a beautiful day in Chicago. I do appreciate you giving up the sun for Neoclassicism. Thank you, Kevin, for those very kind and generous words. I guess you might say we've been friends for a long time, so the appreciation is mutual. Thank you. So let's get to it. So I think everyone here already has a pretty good idea of what neoclassical art means. It refers, obviously, to the new form of classicism based on classical ideals, reaching back to ancient models for inspiration and information. The High Renaissance of the 16th century had its form of classicism, the 17th century had its form of classicism, and it's not surprising then that the 18th century also had a turn to classicism toward the end of the century. For that incarnation was closely connected, of course, to the revolution, though, of course, it also started before the revolution had even been imagined. But it was an important political art combination that is very unusual in the interconnection of the two. In defining the aspects of what neoclassical art entails, it's critical to actually have one of the best examples. For me, whenever neoclassicism is mentioned, basically the first art object that comes to mind is the Oath of the Horatii by David, Jacques-Louis David. And of course, it's a perfect example of everything we want to know about what neoclassicism was, what it represented, what its intentions were, what the artists strove for. From the somberness of the presentation, the seriousness, the sobriety, the clarity, the reduction of a story to just a few individual parts, the archaeological accuracy of the setting, of the clothing, of every little detail, the sculptural forms and poses, the kind of dramatic, rhetorical kind of presentation of the subject matter. All of these things are critical not only to the presentation of the image, but also to the presentation of the story. The narrative was extremely important in neoclassical drawings, and of course, it was very important that the style of presentation matched the seriousness of the story itself. And that was one of the reasons that neoclassicism was started. I mean, why it grew up, why artists were interested in doing this, because what they were reacting against was the Rococo, which was pretty much the exact opposite. On the left, you have a painting by Natoire, Charles Natoire, who was one of the leaders of the French school in the 18th century. On the right is a painting by Georges Rouget, who was David's favorite pupil and who also was his main assistant. And you can see that he follows David in every possible way. The quality of gesture, the quality of form, the quality of the entire presentation echoes very strongly the entire presentation of the Oath of the Horatii, for example. In drawings, too, on the left is Boucher, who was one of the great leaders of the Rococo in France in the 18th century, with a very serious subject. It's the birth of Christ, the adoration of the shepherds, who come crowding into this wonderful barn, stable, and with this wonderfully magical light emanating from the Christ child, but done in a kind of lightness of spirit that is the opposite of the scene on the other side, which is a much more dire kind of subject, the constancy of Eleazar, who has been forced to eat pork against his religion and chooses to die rather than forsake his faith. It's that, by the way, we are going to run into some pretty serious and difficult subject matter, if not downright gruesome, because I don't know why they felt they had to find first of all, the subjects that people had never heard of, certainly we haven't heard of, but they delved deeply into mythology, into religion, into into history, especially ancient history, to find subjects that would resonate with modern political and social mores, desires, hopes, and some of them are really out there, but it's kind of fun to look them up and then discover how many people died in the course of these various paintings. The most important ingredient to neoclassicism was, of course, antiquity. And, of course, studying directly from the ancient objects, in Rome especially, was critical to learning what antiquity entailed, what the antique looked like, what the details should be. And here we have, for example, in the 16th century already, copying from the antique is already in train with Raphael and Giulio Clovio. In the 17th century, the great artist model for doing this is Poussin, Nicolas Poussin, who spent almost his entire career in Rome and dug deeply into every aspect of the culture that was there and antiquity that he could find there. And even if he didn't actually use these objects or figures that he might have seen and copied, they were there in the back of his mind when he was making his own paintings. And of course, he was at the root of a very important type of classicism in the 17th century that was, of course, known by the 18th century artists. He was admired. They taught around him at the French Academy, which was the bastion of academic learning and passing on of academic knowledge about art and craft. But in the 18th century, what the artists really wanted to do was to go back to the original antique art, to go to Rome, to be able to study literally in situ, in front of the objects, to copy them, to study the architecture, to study the decorative arts, every aspect. So it was the great ambition of all of these young artists in Paris to study hard and win the Rome Prize, the Prix de Rome, that allowed them to go to Rome, to live there for 3 years and often more, to live there as a pensioner of the king, and to spend their entire time doing art, making art, and studying the antiquities around them. And this was of critical importance in the 18th century, especially. Here, for example, Renard, who's an architect, is studying pieces, literally, of architecture that have crumbled at Hadrian's Villa. And then, again, Hubert Robert, who did the previous drawing as well, showing an artist, this time outside, studying the antiquities, the ruins, the whatever, that are lying around Rome, just waiting to be copied. So you can imagine, exactly as Hubert Robert shows here, you can imagine these young artists absolutely immersing themselves in Rome, in the ancient world around them. The artist who was the best, the most devoted to doing this, was Jacques-Louis David. He made hundreds of drawings after sculptures, after antiquities, after pieces of ruins, I mean, everything, especially the sculptures. And I would point out the one at the lower left is in the Horvitz Collection, but the other four are from what's called a Roman album. David himself put together albums. He literally would make his drawings and then he would stick them down on album pages and he had 2 giant albums that he kept in his studio that were there for his students when he was back teaching in many hundreds of students in Paris over the course of his career. So these Roman album pages were extremely important and show how serious David was about studying antique. And it wasn't just figures, wasn't just sculpture, it was also the decorative arts. It was the objects that people had in their homes or that were there for religious ceremonies or any purpose that these people needed something, or it could be a basin. I mean, it could be just about anything. In the middle is a photograph of an entire album page. There was more than one drawing on most of these pages. And on the far side, you have drawings that represent, I mean, different art objects that would be held by someone or used by someone in the course of their daily life. And these are the kinds of things that David would then use in his paintings to ensure archaeological accuracy. And sometimes, but not surprisingly, not very often, he would adapt a figure into one of his paintings, in this case, a drawing for the death of the wife of Darius. And you can see in the blow-up at the lower left that the woman from the Roman album in Washington has been reversed, which is interesting. But that gesture, that wonderful sort of curve of her arm and that bend of her back and the leg pushed back is repeated in the painting. He doesn't, it's really interesting that he doesn't actually copy the sculptures into his paintings. He evokes them for the most part. And here he evokes a Roman sculpture in this very famous painting of Madame Récamier, who was a legendary beauty and also the leader of a salon that invited all of the literati and intellectuals in Paris. Everybody wanted to be there. Reclining on a couch that was named for her. It's a Récamier. But you can see, I think, that David is not too far away from the sculpture that he copied on the left. Of very critical importance in the 18th century specifically were all of the discoveries that were being made. First of all, there were digs in Herculaneum and Pompeii that were revealing new things that people knew nothing about, such as paintings. We'll get to that in a moment. But there was also a collector in Naples, William Hamilton, who was an envoy extraordinary to the Kingdom of Naples from the British court, who was there from 1764 to 1800. And he, as soon as he arrived in Naples, he started collecting Greek vases, these wonderfully painted vases. And this book was published very shortly after he got there, 1771, with these full-page illustrations that were executed in prints in black and then were hand-colored to give you that specific orange. And this book was of extreme importance to and interest to the students at the French Academy in Rome, those who had won the Rome Prize. And in the Roman album in Washington, there are some tracings that are literally taken from these pages. This one on the screen now, you can see was probably literally taken from an opening like the one I'm showing you. And it's traced and then worked up a little bit in gray wash to try and bulk up the figures a little bit. The tracings are really kind of weak, and there is very much a question as to whether David himself did the tracings or whether the students in the academy were sharing duties, and some were tracing and some were doing other things, and they shared their drawings and they would give them back and forth. But in this case, what is most interesting is to see this combination of the very linear tracings then worked up into the types of figures that would then appear in paintings by these various artists. One artist who actually comes rather close to that linear quality of the tracings, but much more beautifully and exquisite linear control, is Anne-Louis Giraudet de Roussy-Triozon, Giraudet for short. And in this wonderful drawing of Aeneas welcomed into Hades by the shades of his former comrades. In any case, this gorgeous linear control that he has. This is a type of drawing that's the only type of drawing that evokes this workshop tracing that was in the David album. Giraudet was a student of David's. David had those albums in his studio. Giraudet would have known tracings like this and would certainly have been aware, making a drawing like this, of what he had seen in the past. Also, this kind of tracing has a wider effect. It does affect to a certain extent what some paintings look like. This is Garnier, who studied with Vien and David. Vien and David. They either studied with Vien or they studied with David, and very few studied with anybody else. But they had a huge outreach effect. And this, as in the tracings, those there was a special appreciation in those tracings. What they recorded were Greek figures as opposed to Roman figures. And there was an interesting, I wouldn't call it a battle, but there was a dichotomy. You followed the Roman kind of classical art, or you followed the Greek kind of classical art. The Romans were more muscular. They were more heavy in your face. The Greeks were more lyrical. There was a kind of finer beauty involved, a different kind of idealization. And the artists who followed sort of the Greek mode tended to go more for nude figures, no matter what the subject matter. This happens to be a fairly sexy subject, with Anacreon, who was a poet and wrote wonderful lyrics. He was one of the great poets in the Greek pantheon. But he also had this sybaritic side. He loved women, he loved boys, he loved music, and they're all represented here. It's got it covered, certainly. A lot was going on at this point in Pompeii and Herculaneum. The discovery of paintings was very important to the idea of these young artists seeing a true antique form of painting, real antiquity. What did paintings look like at that time? And you get the shallow space that you'll find in a lot of the neoclassical artists. You get the poses in profile, perfect profile. You get the calmness that you get. And then you have Vien, who taught many of these artists, literally being inspired by this particular painting, presumably known through a print because he's reversed the composition, but not copying, but interpreting the composition very closely. And this Vien is the beginning of true neoclassical art in France. This is in 1761 or 3, can't remember what the date is, 1763. And this is the beginning of neoclassical art. Vien is the one who's credited with it. And it starts slowly. So that you have, even in the 1770s, you have Doyen on the left and Lejeune, who hardly anybody knows anything about. We really don't even have a biography of Lejeune, but this fabulous drawing showing the Feast of Absalon is by him, signed fully, thank God. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known. Dated, gives us all the information. And on the left, Doyen Cybele, who's tormented by the elements. She is the goddess. She is the mother goddess of the universe, and she's being tormented here by her actual elements. So I couldn't find out exactly what this story meant, but Absalon, this is sort of the beginning of these wonderfully difficult subjects where Absalom's sister Tamar had been raped by Amnon, and he invites Amnon to a feast and gets him drunk and basically kills him as retribution. I mean, it's very simple, very simple. But you can see that there's an awful lot of activity in these two paintings. There's a lot going on, drawings, and they are very busy, completely different from what we saw in the beginning with David, what we've seen with the others that I've shown so far. And it does take a little while for neoclassical style and taste to catch on. One of the first, surprisingly, is Greuze, who's known for his sort of moral subject matter and his rather sentimental drawings of heads, expressive heads, sometimes a little over the top. In here, he has Psyche crowning Cupid with a crown of purity. I'm not sure Psyche fit that. And Modesty, who's looking on, is looking kind of askance at that kind of idea. I will say it's a wonderfully expressive drawing. And then on the left, we have Gamelin, Jacques Gamelin, doing, one of the great sources for all of these subjects is Homer and Hector in the Palace of Paris, the beginnings of the Trojan War. And there's still an element here of, more than an element, of the Rococo that hasn't disappeared yet. Wonderful shadowing here that's caused by blue wash of the paper. So before he made the drawing, he washed the paper blue. And then that wonderful light in the center, and it's actually Helen in the center. Hector's over on the side. He's just a sort of sub-player there. But then we get to David. And David is the great exponent of Neoclassicism. Two examples from apparently the same year or about the same moment. Andromache, Mourning the Death, was actually for his reception piece at the Academy. So this is actually a very important drawing, a study on the way to the final composition. And the other is the story of Septimius Severus appearing to Caracalla. So Septimius Severus is the father of Caracalla and Geta. Caracalla, who did not want to share power with his brother after their father died, kills his brother Geta. And so Septimius Severus appears to him to tell him he was a bad boy. And you get this very clear disposition of the compositions that is absolutely characteristic of the neoclassical mode. And this sets the standard for this particular aspect of neoclassicism. And what I'd like to say at this point is that we think of neoclassicism as something of a monolith, that it's a movement that encompasses everything, that only the neoclassical artists are working. And in the last sort of 20 years of the 18th century, that everything that the French are doing at this point is pretty much the same kind of thing, just slightly different because each artist has his own approach. Say his advisedly. There are some women, but not yet. But we still have artists who are, I don't know, clinging or just standing firm with the more lively kind of composition of the Rococo. Again, same year, set against a much more stark kind of presentation of the story by Vincent. Wonderful one on the left, Jeanne Hachette, Jean of the Hatchet, because she saves Beauvais during a siege when the town is attacked, and she literally takes an axe to one of the opponents and knocks him back and saves the day. And the story of Arria and Paitis, I have to tell you, I had to look this one up. I didn't know it at all. Paitis does something really bad, and he is condemned to death and decides that he needs to take his own life, but he can't do it. So his wife takes the knife, Arria takes the knife, stabs herself, and said, "See, that didn't hurt." It's all about heroism. It's all about the moral example. It's very repetitive, but it is very effective. This fabulous drawing by Etienne Barthélemy Garnier. This is perhaps the most gruesome story. I have to tell it, though. I'm sorry. Tereus. So we have two sisters here, Philomena and Procne. Procne is married to Tereus, and Philomena, her sister, he lusted after her and raped her. Cut out her tongue so she couldn't tell anybody, held her in captivity so she couldn't tell anybody, and she managed to get word to her sister by weaving words into a tapestry. And her sister then frees her, and they decide that they are going to get retribution. And they kill his son, who is actually Procne's son, and they feed his body to him. And then they bring the head of the son, and he learns of the horrible thing, really horrible thing that just happened. Anyway, wow. Who thinks up this stuff? I don't know. Anyway, Much more banal on the other side is Virgil reading the Aeneid to Augustus and Octavia. Very easy. Nothing horrible there, except that in book 6 that he's reading of the Aeneid, this is when Aeneas goes into the underworld, as he had done in the drawing by Girodet, and he sees also not just his own former colleagues and soldiers, but he also sees some great men from the future. And one of the people that he sees is a young man with a cloud over his head, and it turns out that it is Octavia's son, who has just died. So she is overcome. As I will tell you, most of the women are in most of these paintings. It's a thing. What I didn't just point out, I probably should just briefly, is the different kind of presentation of the subject. They're both neoclassical, they're both restrained, they're both limited to just a small number of figures. They're both pushed right up to the front of the picture plane. But the actual execution is quite different. So Julien of Parme on the far side is more free and open, and he uses that wonderful light through the washes, and then Garnier is using pen and ink and wash and this wonderful, brilliant light to pick out the various key features of the drawing with, by the way, the head exactly in the center of the composition. Can't miss it. Then we have these two wonderful, again, I'm showing kind of opposites, but these are, Taillasson is one of the, yet another student of Vien, and Gérard is a student of David, but you have them working basically in the same technique, pen and ink and wash, gray, maybe at different stages of the composition process, so you have a greater freedom in the Taillasson, and then a really worked up, beautifully precise, wonderfully executed drawing of Venus giving the arms created for Aeneas to her son Aeneas. And Taillasson is this is a drawing, so he's maybe a little bit livelier here than he will be in the final painting. We saw a different version of Hector being mourned by Andromache by David, totally different, just 3 characters. And here you have the entire family, all of the friends, everybody is there, but Hector on his bier at the center. But it's interesting that there can be different moments that an artist is choosing to use different styles to execute their subjects and their compositions. One of the things, I mean, personally, let me just interject this here. Neoclassicism has not been my most favorite aspect of 18th century French art. I mean, I studied Watteau, not at all anything like the neoclassical artists at the other end of the century. It has taken time for me to spend some time with these artists to appreciate not just the subject matter, which is a whole different thing, but the execution, the control, the skill, the talent, whatever, the God-given gift that many of them have in their ability to create drawings that are not just expressive and beautifully composed, but also downright beautiful. And I think these 2 artists who are both making book illustrations, in this case, highly worked up, beautifully worked up, are absolutely just at the top of their game. They're absolutely, totally precise in every stroke of the pen. It's so admirable. It is just, I love drawings that you just see the skill of the artist, and you just kind of, your jaw drops sometimes. They can do it so well. So moving to the building blocks. So without the study of the human figure, these artists would not have been able to produce the paintings and compositions that they did. And the human figure is at the base of everything in French art. The very first thing that these artists learn to do is study the human figure. The male academy on the left is literally the kind of drawing that would be done at the academy, first in Paris, or it was also done in Rome. Studying from the posed model, there were sessions every week. They had seasoned artists who were the professors who taught these young students, and learning how to draw the human figure was the basis of everything. Now, at the academy, the models who posed were men, and women were not allowed to draw at the academy in those sessions. In fact, men were not allowed to draw women in any kind of public setting, nude women, in any kind of public setting. If they wanted to do that, they pretty much had to hire their own person to do it privately somewhere, at least for a while. But then you have Henriette Lorimier, who is actually doing a French Academy drawing of a woman. Well, she was a woman, so she could draw from the nude. But at the end of the 18th century, drawing from the female nude is not as banned as it used to be. But this is the kind of drawing that every artist was supposed to learn how to make. And from that, the study of figures in motion, figures clothed, figures nude, all of that is part of the training of these artists. And when they had a composition, they would literally draw every figure, make a drawing. Most of them made drawings for every figure, because then they could be sure how every detail would look, how every fold of drapery would look. These were essential drawings. And each artist had his or her own chosen preference for medium, pen and ink with wash and white heightening, or chalk, on blue paper, on brown paper. There's a great deal of variety in these kinds of drawings. And there's a wonderful group in the exhibition. These are all in there, and there are a few more besides. Proudhon is one of the most beautiful. He does a beautiful drawing of the male nude. Saint-Ours, who studied with Vien, yet again, is more in the classical mode here. And Proudhon studied with David, and he's not into the muscular human form, he's into the more beautiful human form, the more perfect kind of idealization of what the human form should be, more in the Greek manner. And of course, these figure studies sometimes grow into something more. One of the things about Neoclassicism that isn't maybe always expected, though I've already shown you a couple of examples, is the sexy part. I mean, this is Danae with Jupiter coming down as a shower of gold, and she is in an ecstatic state because of it. And it's just a gorgeous drawing of a woman, a gorgeous drawing of an interior, wonderful use of black and the white of the paper to express this ecstatic state, and quite different from this other Proudhon, the drawing of a woman, very close in the same kind of black chalk on blue paper with white heightening as the young man we just saw before. And then Jean-François Jeanninet, who's actually a printmaker. He's a color printmaker, but look at him working in black. It's really, really wonderful. This is not a study for anything that I know of, maybe for a print, but it's not a subject, it's not a narrative. It is just a gorgeously rendered drawing of a figure, a draped female figure. Gesture is everything. I mean, sure, you've seen this as we've been through these various images. Gesture. You watch the hands, watch what they do and how they express. Faces are important too, but when it comes to these neoclassical artists, gesture, the rhetorical pose is really very important. And then on the right, you have this allegory, melancholic figure. He studied with Vincent, and this is again, these black drawings. I have a thing, I really like black drawings. On blue paper, on gray paper, on brown paper, heightened with white, not heightened with white. I think what artists do with a very simple medium, chalk or charcoal, is extraordinary. And we have another example with this Boiseau. He's a sculptor and drawing a sculpture, which is great. You know, a lot of these artists won the Prix de Rome, by the way, so almost all of them end up in Rome in one way or another. They get completely drawn in to what they study there and bring it home with them. Boiseau was not as attached to a full neoclassical sort of aesthetic as others were, but here he is, because this is celebrating the first anniversary of the revolution. So this has to be in the style that is appropriate for the revolution. Next to that is a very, very complex allegory by Louis Laffitte, which is incredibly complicated. He studied with Regnault. Regnault is another major artist at the time, but he doesn't have quite the huge studio that both Vien and David do. But there are all sorts of things going on here, and I have the image in front of me, but war. These are the things that happen when life turns truly horrible because of war. And in the back you have the Temple of Janus that is sort of a symbol of the new beginnings, and you have the open door, which means that war is in play here. And you have in the foreground the arts with their various implements strewn on the ground. On the left you have families that are selling their goods, getting rid of everything because they have no money. They have lost everything. You have a money lender, the standing man, who's actually giving a man a coin. You have despair. You have trade that has simply stopped. Agriculture is dead. Everything, there's a man to the left of the central figure, yes, there's a tiny little lamb on his lap, and the man, that's innocence. That's a symbol for innocence, and that man's about to be whacked. So you have this incredibly complex drawing, I mean, full of references to all the bad things that can happen because of war. And there is one, I've got to find it. There's one reference. There's a banner with the word Salutus Omni Furere, which seems to refer to something from the early days of the Roman Republic, so going back in time, relating something now to what was then. And it has to do with the form of borrowing and lending was done away. Everybody was freed from borrowing and lending. That meant they had enough to live on. And I must confess that I do not understand all of this allegory. I don't know that anybody can, but Isabel has done a wonderful job describing it, so thanks for that. And here is another story that I'd never heard of, and an artist that you probably haven't heard of either, Armand Charles Carafe, who's another pupil of David. But he's a kind of unique. His style is a little bit different from everybody else's, and so we just go with him. But this is a story from Antiquity, where the man at right, under all the military implements, is trying to change all of the laws of Sparta because Sparta has gone bad. Evil and avarice and decadence has taken control, and he wants to go back to the laws of Lycurgus, who had set everything up years and centuries before. But in the end, and they're burning some of the laws that had happened in between, where everything went bad. And in the end, August gets killed by the decadent, fun-loving, pleasure-loving Spartans, so it didn't end well for him, I'm afraid. And then we have these two, I love the juxtaposition, partly, I don't know, chosen by accident or not, where we have two prominent figures who are being welcomed to the Elysian fields. On the left, you have Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, who the French loved, by the way, is welcoming Marquis de Mirabeau into the fields. Franklin had died the year before. This is 1791. Mirabeau, who was a prominent orator and statesman, who died in 1791, and a national hero, father of the Revolution, is being welcomed, of course. And then you have Francis IV, who's, welcoming this young hero who died at the age of 23 while defending against a mutiny, and therefore a hero as well. Then we have, death, reminders of death everywhere, constant. But not in Racine. Racine is getting crowned on the right in this beautiful, fully complete. Both of these drawings are wonderfully precise, and they're bigger than I expected. I didn't get to see the show until very briefly, just running through. But a lot of these drawings are big and really impressive, physically impressive. I'm racing a little bit because I've taken too much time, but a student of Vincent, different one, Thévenin, a little bit of reportage. He's capturing an event that actually happened in 1789 when a crowd of rioters protesting prices and the cost of food and cost of living were charged by a royal brigade, the protector of the king, and people were injured, and it was a very bad situation, and it's recorded, and it happens on the 12th of July in 1789, and 2 days later is the Bastille. So things are getting hot. And then on the right is drawn much later, but an event that happened in 1795 with martyrs of the Prairial. Again, a story that is not well known, but 6 of them are condemned to death after they rise up, and unsuccessfully. And 3 of them, they all decide that they want to die in prison, that they want to kill themselves and not have a public execution. And 3 of them have successfully killed themselves, but the others have to go off to war, to be executed. Jean Racine's totally different. Private, family, honoring family, but in a way that is has nothing to do with these grand stories of classical antiquity. This is going on too, and we kind of forget about it, but these are beautiful renderings of scenes of family. Both of these come in pairs, and both of the drawings, all 4 drawings, are in the exhibition. And again, this beautiful use of the black. And ordinary scenes of people in their ordinary lives. There is an ordinary life that's still going on. This is after the revolution, I will say. But there's been a lot of political upheavals in the meantime with Bonaparte and the restorations and various other things going on. But these are 2 really gorgeous and big watercolors by 2 really, again, gifted artists, just showing real life. And I had to show this one because we need some humor. And this is, I love this drawing, I will say. And I don't know if you've seen Dangerous Liaisons with John Malkovich, but the very first scene, he's being powdered like that. And that must have come from this image, which was, there was a print made after it. But to have that cone over the face and having powder all over his head is really quite fabulous. In the 19th century, things change, of course. The fashion for neoclassicism begins to fade. Romanticism begins to come in. Different view of how things should be portrayed, how they should be expressed. whole different style. Meunier, who made this drawing, actually is a great part of neoclassical drawings and paintings. But here, I mean, this is an explosion of vitality and action, and very, very different from what we've been looking at. And this is not the beginning, but this is the full-blown change that takes place at this point. But there are still vestiges of the neoclassical, and the person who really carries Davidian neoclassicism into the 19th century, does not disappear, is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, J.A.D. Ingres, who is, one of David's students, and I show a copy after a sculpture. It's actually not done when he's a student, it's done a little bit later, and an early composition drawing that he made when he was in David's studio, very Davidian in its effect. And 1811, he made this painting. It's huge, 8 feet by 8 feet, that shows Thetis beseeching Jupiter to spare her son Achilles, to actually quell some problems that he was having with Agamemnon, and they're both engaged in the attacks on Troy. And it's interesting, this painting from 1811, Ingres doesn't let it go as far as the composition, and he goes back to it and back to it. And here he is going back to it in 1848. We have someone working in this style that late in the 19th century, and Ingres doesn't actually die until the 1860s, and he just carries this torch of the neoclassical mode into the 19th century. But then everything is changing. He dies in 1867, and that's Manet. That's the Impressionists are about to burst onto the scene. So this last vestige of neoclassicism is this. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.